Angel Reese was traded, and Chicago didn't even blink. No chaos. No outrage. No frantic press conferences trying to justify the decision. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural when a player of her profile disappears overnight. One day she's the face of headlines, the next she's gone, and the franchise moves forward like nothing ever happened. And that's where this story stops being normal. Because players like Angel Reese aren't supposed to leave quietly. Not two-time All-Stars. Not record-breaking rebounders. Not one of the most recognizable names in women's basketball. Moves like that usually shake a locker room, split a fan base, spark debates across every sports network. But this didn't. And that silence? That's the first clue. Because while the outside world saw a superstar being given up for next to nothing, inside Chicago, this may have been something else entirely. Not a loss. Not a gamble. An escape. The narrative around Angel Reese was powerful. Double-doubles. Historic rebounding numbers. A relentless presence in the paint. On the surface, it looked like the kind of production you build a franchise around. But basketball isn't played on the surface. Look deeper, and the picture starts to shift. A post player operating almost entirely near the rim, shooting under 40%. Let that sink in. These aren't contested fadeaways or late-clock desperation shots. This is efficiency in the one area she's supposed to dominate. And when that number barely climbs, it doesn't signal growth. It signals a ceiling. Defenses saw it, and they adjusted. They stopped respecting her range entirely. Sagged off. Collapsed the paint. Turned every possession into traffic. And suddenly, those impressive stat lines began to tell a different story, not dominance, but dependency. Because here's the twist nobody talks about. A significant portion of those rebounds came off her own misses. Same possession. Same sequence. Missed, recovered, reset. On paper, it's a rebound. In reality, it's a broken play that never truly ended. An offense forced to restart, over and over again, burning time, energy, and rhythm just to get back where it began. The box score celebrated it. The game itself did not. And slowly, almost invisibly, it started to cost them. Because while the numbers stacked up, the wins didn't. The team didn't evolve. The offense didn't flow. Teammates weren't elevated. They were waiting. Waiting for extra possessions, extra chances, extra corrections. That's not how great teams function. Now place that reality next to what was happening elsewhere in the league. At the exact same time, a rookie walked into Indiana and flipped everything upside down. Not just with stats, but with impact. Every player around her improved. Spacing opened. Movement sharpened. Opportunities appeared where none existed before. The offense didn't stall. It expanded. That's the difference people felt, even if they couldn't explain it. One player required the system to bend around her. The other became the system. And once you see that contrast clearly, the gap doesn't look small anymore. It looks massive. But even that isn't the real breaking point. Because numbers can be debated. Systems can be adjusted. Players can develop. Culture, though, that's different. That's fragile. And once it cracks, everything else follows. The turning point didn't happen in a game. It didn't come from a stat sheet. It came from moments, small at first, then impossible to ignore. A public claim that forced the league into investigation and came back with nothing. No evidence. No confirmation. Just noise that pulled the organization into unwanted spotlight before the season even found its rhythm. Then came something even harder to repair. A veteran teammate. Injured. Recovering. Vulnerable. A respected champion who chose Chicago to build something meaningful. And instead of support, she was questioned. Publicly. On record. Doubt wasn't kept in-house. It was broadcast. In that moment, something shifted in the locker room. Not loudly. Not immediately. But permanently. Because every player understood what it meant. If you struggled, if you got hurt, if you stopped being useful, you wouldn't hear it from a coach. You'd hear it through the media. Trust doesn't survive that realization. It dissolves. And when trust disappears, chemistry follows. Then effort. Then belief. Even the on-court partnerships began to fracture. The kind that should anchor a team's future instead started showing signs of strain. reports of tension, moments of disconnect. Eventually, situations that couldn't be smoothed over or explained away. At that point, the decision in front of Chicago wasn't about talent anymore. It was about direction. Because you can't build a future while repairing the present every single day. You can't develop a core if that core doesn't believe in each other. And you definitely can't grow if every step forward risks pulling the entire structure backward. So they made the call. Quietly. Decisively. No hesitation. Because from their perspective, the real risk wasn't trading Angel Reese. The real risk was keeping her. And that's the twist that changes everything. What looked like a franchise giving up a star may have actually been a franchise stepping out of an illusion. Not of talent, but of impact. Not of production, but of value. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing in sports isn't a bad player. It's a player who looks great on paper but slowly breaks everything around her. And when that realization finally becomes clear, you don't make noise. You don't start a war. You just move on. Silently. It didn't explode. It didn't even echo. Angel Reese called out her own team, and instead of shaking the league, it quietly fractured something far more important. Because on the surface, it sounded like leadership. It sounded like a competitor refusing to tolerate losing. A player demanding more, pushing standards higher, challenging a struggling organization to rise. That's how it was framed. That's how many people wanted to hear it. But context changes everything. Those words weren't spoken after she left. They weren't part of a reflection or a post-exit critique. They came while she was still inside that locker room. Still under contract. Still sharing the floor, the practice space, the daily grind with the very teammates she was publicly questioning. And that transforms the meaning completely. Because now it's not accountability. Now it's exposure. Every teammate heard it. Every family member read it. Every player across the league saw it and quietly asked themselves the same question. What would it feel like to play next to that? That moment didn't raise standards. It lowered trust. And once trust is gone, everything else starts to collapse behind it. That's when the situation crossed a line no organization can ignore. The suspension wasn't sudden. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't a reaction to one bad press conference or one rough stretch of games. It was the final step in a process that had been building for months. Because suspensions for conduct detrimental to the team don't come out of nowhere. They are documented, layered, carefully constructed through repeated incidents, internal conversations, warnings that never quite stick, and attempts to correct behavior that never quite change it. It's a paper trail, a quiet one, until it isn't. And once that document exists, everything shifts. Because now the situation isn't just internal frustration, it's official, structured, defensible. The organization has something tangible they can point to, something that justifies a decision that might otherwise look shocking from the outside. At that point, the trade stops being a possibility. It becomes inevitable. The only remaining questions are timing and price. And when that moment arrived, Chicago didn't hesitate. Because they already knew. Now shift the focus to Atlanta, the team that stepped in and made the move. From the outside, it was packaged perfectly. A bold acquisition. A dynamic talent added to a competitive roster. A piece that could elevate a team already knocking on the door. It sounded convincing. It always does. Until you look at the details. Because rosters aren't built on headlines. They're built on fit. And fit is where this starts to unravel. Atlanta already had a front court. Not just bodies, but established players who operate in the exact same space. Players who need touches near the rim. Players who create their value inside the paint. Now add another player with the same requirements. Same tendencies. Same limitations stretching the floor. And suddenly the math stops working. 3 players, 1 area of the court. Finite space. Finite possessions. Infinite congestion. Defenses won't need to adjust. They'll simplify. Collapse the paint. Eliminate driving lanes. Ignore the perimeter. Force the offense into a crowded, suffocating environment where every possession becomes harder than it needs to be. And that pressure doesn't just affect the bigs. It trickles outward. Because Atlanta's true strength wasn't just inside. It was the balance. the spacing that allowed their guards to operate freely, the movement that created openings, the rhythm that made everything flow. Compress that space, and you don't just add a player. You change the entire ecosystem. And ecosystems don't always survive change. That's why even their own fans hesitated. Not out of doubt in talent, but out of understanding. They've watched this team. They know what made it work. And they can see, almost immediately, how fragile that structure becomes under the wrong pressure. But even that isn't the biggest gamble Atlanta made. The real gamble isn't on the court. It's in the locker room. Because everything that unfolded in Chicago didn't happen in isolation. It wasn't a single incident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Public comments, internal tension, a suspension backed by documentation, moments that stacked on top of each other until the organization reached a breaking point. And Atlanta saw all of it. Every detail, every signal, and still decided that a new environment would change the outcome. That belief is not new in professional sports. It's been tested for decades. And more often than not, it fails. Because behavior doesn't belong to a building. It travels. It follows the player into every new locker room, every new system, every new set of teammates. Different cities, same patterns unless something fundamental changes. And that's the part no press release can guarantee. So now Atlanta isn't just integrating a player. They're absorbing a risk that extends beyond spacing, beyond rotations, beyond shot selection. A risk that touches chemistry, the one thing that can't be forced, coached, or manufactured. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, something else happened. Something quieter. Something far less visible but far more important. They got their locker room back. And that doesn't show up in trade grades. It doesn't trend on social media. But inside an organization, it changes everything. Because suddenly, the energy shifts. The daily tension disappears. Meetings become about basketball again, not damage control. Practices become cleaner, lighter, more focused. The invisible weight is gone. And in its place, there's clarity, direction. A foundation they can actually build on. That foundation has a name. Camila Cardoso. A player whose game fits naturally into the modern structure of basketball. Efficient, composed, impactful in ways that don't require excess. A presence that adds to the system instead of demanding the system revolve around her. And more importantly, a player they can build around without conflict. Because keeping both was never sustainable. Not long-term. Not realistically. So, when the decision came, it wasn't complicated. It just looked that way from the outside. Now, let's talk about the return, the part that triggered the loudest reactions. Late first-round picks. Future assets. Nothing that screams equal value to a casual observer. And that's exactly why people called it a loss. But that reaction misses something critical. Real stars don't get traded quietly. They create bidding wars. Multiple teams step in. Offers escalate. The market becomes aggressive because everyone understands what's at stake. That didn't happen here. There was no frenzy. No competition. Just one team and silence from the rest of the league. And that silence? That was the real valuation. 28 other franchises looked at the full picture, the numbers, the fit, the history, the risk, and collectively decided not to engage. That's not coincidence. That's consensus. Chicago didn't get outplayed. They read the room and acted accordingly. Because at some point, holding on becomes more expensive than letting go. Not financially, structurally, culturally. So they made the move. Quickly. Quietly. Without hesitation. And just like that, the chapter closed. No dramatic farewell. No drawn-out saga. Just a reset. Now the paths diverge. In Chicago, a rebuild rooted in stability begins. In Atlanta, a gamble unfolds. And across the league, the balance continues to shift, subtly, steadily, without waiting for anyone to catch up. Because trades like this don't reveal their truth immediately. They take time. They play out in chemistry, in results, in moments that don't make headlines but define seasons. And by the time the answer becomes obvious, it's already permanent. So, this was never just about who won the trade. It was about something deeper. One team choosing clarity over chaos, another choosing potential over certainty. And somewhere down the line, when everything settles, one question will remain. Did Atlanta rewrite the story or walk straight into the one Chicago was trying to escape? And here's where the story takes an even sharper turn. Because what Chicago did wasn't just a roster move. It was a reset of power. Not the kind you see in standings or highlight reels, but the kind that lives inside a locker room, inside conversations that never reach cameras, inside the small moments where teams either come together or quietly fall apart. For 2 seasons, Chicago wasn't just playing opponents. They were managing tension, managing perception, managing a situation that kept pulling attention away from the one thing that actually wins games: cohesion. And cohesion is fragile. It doesn't break all at once. It erodes. Slowly. Quietly. One comment at a time, one reaction at a time. One moment where a player hesitates, not because of the defense, but because of what might happen if something goes wrong. That hesitation is deadly. Because once players start thinking instead of trusting, the game speeds up and they slow down. Passes come a fraction too late. Rotations fall a step behind. Decisions become safer, smaller, less decisive. And suddenly, a team that looks talented on paper starts losing games it should win. Not because they lack skill, but because they lack alignment. That's what Chicago is fighting. And it's what they chose to end. Now flip that forward. Because the real impact of this trade isn't about what Chicago lost. It's about what they unlocked. A system without friction. A hierarchy without confusion. A locker room where players don't have to look over their shoulder before speaking, before playing, before making a mistake. Because make no mistake, mistakes are where trust is tested. And in Chicago, mistakes had started to carry consequences beyond the game. That's the environment they escaped. And environments like that don't fix themselves. They require a decision. A hard one. The kind that doesn't look good on social media. The kind that gets criticized immediately. The kind that only makes sense months later, when the noise fades and the results start to speak. That's the bet Chicago made. Not on talent, on stability. Now let's shift back to Atlanta, because this is where the pressure begins. They didn't just acquire a player. They inherited a storyline. And storylines don't stay quiet. They follow every performance, every missed shot, every loss, every moment where something feels slightly off, but no one can quite explain why. And in a league that watches everything, every interaction, every body language cue, every sideline reaction, that pressure multiplies quickly. Because expectations were set the moment the trade happened. This wasn't framed as a project. It was framed as a solution. And solutions are judged differently. They don't get time. They get results. Immediately. But here's the problem with that expectation. Atlanta's system wasn't broken. It was working. They had identity, flow, spacing, roles that made sense. And when you insert a new piece into something that already works, you're not just adding, you're adjusting everything else to make space for it. And that's where risk lives. Because every adjustment has a cost. Touches get redistributed. Shots shift. Players who are comfortable suddenly have to rethink their positioning, their timing, their rhythm. And rhythm is everything in basketball. Disrupt it, and even great players start to look ordinary. That's the danger Atlanta now faces. Not whether Angel Reese can produce numbers, but whether those numbers come at the expense of what already made them dangerous. And that's a much harder equation to solve. Because it's not about individual performance anymore. It's about collective balance. And balance is easy to lose. Very hard to rebuild. Now layer in the human element. Because systems don't operate on diagrams. They operate on people. On personalities. On trust. Atlanta's locker room had something forming. Not perfect, but real. A core that understood each other. A dynamic that was evolving naturally. Players growing into roles without forcing it. Now introduce a new presence. A strong one. A loud one. On and off the court. And instantly the dynamic shifts. Not necessarily for the worse, but definitely not the same. And not the same is where uncertainty begins. Because chemistry doesn't restart at zero. It gets recalibrated. And during that recalibration, things can go one of two ways. It can click, or it can crack. There's no middle ground for long. Meanwhile, Chicago watches from a distance. Quieter now, lighter, focused. And that's when something interesting starts to happen. Without the constant noise, players begin to grow. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, because